So, assalamu alaikum to everyone, and good evening, good afternoon, good day to everyone that is here with us, depending, of course, on where you are joining us from. So, I will be briefly talking, or I'll be giving us a perspective on African take on the current genocide perpetrated by the state of Israel or by Israel. I will be discussing a few things. If you can go to the next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, so I will try in my presentation to talk about the previous one, to talk about these few points that I have just highlighted here. So I will try to give us a little historical context about, Africa or African response or African view about the Palestine-Israeli conflict over the years, before even the end of the Cold War and after after the end of the Cold War, that means was Cold War, and then coming, of course, or leading up to the current situation that we're in. So we'll be able to now make sense of what is going on, and we can be also able to make sense of the South African case against Israel, the genocidal case. So without further ado, I will just go straight into the next slide. Okay, so just go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the first one, introduction, please. Maybe I will just talk briefly about, what to discuss. You are in a very advanced one, Sister Milzat.
I'm in the introduction.
I don't know. From my side, it showed me diplomatic ties with Israel and Palestine. Okay, now we can see. Now we can see the introduction slide. Okay, so first of all, for us to make sense of what is going on there, or for the African response to Israel aggression against Palestine or the current genocide that is going on the people of Gaza. First, we have to understand African nations' view. We have to understand their own historical background. These are countries that were colonized by the West. So pretty much they view things from Western imperialism kind of perspective. That's how they view things. Majority of them, of course, we have to be very careful here. We cannot generalize because we are talking about an entire continent, and within this continent we have got 54 independent countries. So these 54 independent countries definitely will not be uniform in how they approach and how they deal with a particular issue. So this first we have to keep in our mind, because otherwise then we will be maybe we might get lost in the generalization of the whole Africa as one, but that is not the case here. So wherever possible, I will try really to highlight where probably other countries are not with the majority of the countries in the continent or on the continent. So as I said, African countries are countries that came from this Western colonialism, and the entire continent is a continent that has been colonized. I think for all the 54 countries that we have in Africa, only 2 of them were not colonized by the Western countries. And even the other one also, which is Liberia, one could argue also was colonized or was under the American influence. Until date, of course, they remain under so. So this also is very much debatable. So probably the only one entity that was free from the Western colonialism was Ethiopia. That was the only country that wasn't really colonized in the real sense of colonialism. So this is the makeup of African countries, and that is how they view things. That is how they try to understand things. many, of course, there are many African countries that have established a good relationship or diplomatic relationship and economic relationship with the state of Israel over the years. But if we're talking about majority here, majority have been, of course, against the policies of Israel, and they have been, in any instance, or in many instances, they have been going against the state of Israel. So this also we have to keep in our mind. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is one slide, I believe, that will give us a general perspective about how Africa relate to this particular issue of Israel and Palestine. The entire continent, as you can see, can be divided into three, okay, all the countries on the continent. We do have countries that recognize only Palestine throughout the continent, okay? We do have those countries that only recognize Palestine and they don't recognize Israel. And we do have countries that also recognize the state of Israel, though these are very, very few. We have got only 3 countries throughout the continent. That means out of 54 countries that we have on the continent, only 3 countries, or two to three, the other one also is debatable. So only 2 countries, which are Eritrea and Cameroon. And of course, we'll understand why later on when I further explain the African makeup or the identity of the African foreign policy. So then we can be able to understand that. So, but the overwhelming majority of African countries, they recognize or they want to have a 2-state solution there. They want to have, or they maintain a good relationship with Israel, and at the same time also, or somehow, not really a good relationship, but somehow some form of diplomatic relationship with Israel, but also a good relationship with with Palestinian authorities. So we do find a lot of over all these countries, you find Palestinian embassies and representatives across the continent. So this is also something that we have to keep in our mind. Can you please move on? All right, so one thing that I would like to do before we go into, or we arrive at the current state that we are in, we should look at the voting pattern of African countries on Israeli-Palestinian conflict over the years in the UN. So during the Cold War, how was it? And we shouldn't also lose perspective of the African foreign policy, majority of African countries' foreign policy during that particular era. That was an era that was pretty much divided by the superpower rivalry between the USSR and USA. So there was a lot of influence of these 2 countries, though we also have to keep in our mind that a large number of African countries were members of non-aligned movement. So many of them, they try to stay away from this kind of issues because they were non-aligned. But despite that, I found after looking, when I look into the data, especially the voting data on Palestinian right issues over the course of almost 20 to 30 years before the end of the Cold War, I found that almost on all occasions, African countries, overwhelmingly, almost all of them around between 47 to 49, they always unanimously vote for the motion. That means for giving the right of for giving right to Palestinians, which is quite stark and quite remarkable, and is something that we have to keep in our mind. Even those countries that did not recognize the state of Palestine also tend to vote for the Palestinian right. I was even surprised to also find some countries that were pretty much the stooge of, let's say, African imperialist countries, like Cameroon, for example, on the continent, which usually follows the politics of France. I also found that they have been voting also for Palestinian right. Liberia, which you tend to always follow the American view on every issue, also they voted for the Palestinian right over the course of that period. After the Cold War, the things pretty much remain the same, especially the first decade or the last decade of the 20th century. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, okay. The next slide. Yes. Still it is the same slide we see.
It is.
Yeah, maybe it's getting stuck. Okay. Anyway, I will continue talking while you're trying to fix that. So during the no, before this one.
It's this one, I believe. Voting patterns.
Yeah, but I see African Union and Israel. Okay, yes. So this one. Oh, yeah. So you can see also during the Cold War, because we have to understand when we're talking about the world politics after the end of the Cold War, we really have to understand one thing. That time, the United States became the sole superpower in the world. And it was pretty much the country that was making the rules, and everybody else has to follow. And if you could recall, that is exactly the time that coincided with the wave of democracy and liberalism, because the US was alone at the time. The communism was officially dead at that particular time. So the US pretty much was getting it its way. So because of that, then we saw also a change on the voting pattern of some African countries. Probably they started to yield to the pressure, or at least they were trying to please United States, and started to vote in favor of Israel. But one thing also that is remarkable, even during this period of time when the United States was pretty much the superpower, the sole superpower of the world, I found that still I couldn't even say majority, because it is like only 2, 3, and a few countries that you find that usually follow the U.S. Desire in voting in favor of what the U.S. wants, but majority still remain for in favor of the cause of the Palestinians, and voting actually in favor of Palestinian people or Palestinian state. So this remained pretty much the same, and there have been, of course, over the years, many factors that determine this kind of pattern in terms of voting behavior of African countries, especially in the UN. So some of them, of course, is some economic ties, regional alliances, and aspirations for international recognition, and sometimes also regime type on Africa, in some of the African countries. So when there is a regime change, then there is sometimes a possibility of that particular regime maybe changing the course of its foreign policy. So all these are factors that, of course, we have to keep in mind when looking at how Africa individually and collectively have been responding to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. All right. Can you go to the next, please? Okay. So, but something that I should bring to our understanding is, we all know that African Union is the main diplomatic forum of African countries. But before that, of course, there was OAU, Organization of African Union, which was disbanded back in 2001. So during and immediately after the end of the Cold War, Israel has been pursuing the African countries, trying to get them to listen to them and to give them, or to grant them observatory status on OAU. And with the end of the Cold War, they got their wish, because, as I said, the United States was pretty much the superpower at the time. So many regions or regional organizations yielded to the pressure of the United States. So after that, now in 2001, in 2001, the African countries decided to dismantle the old regional organization, or continental organization for that matter. So they dismantled the OAU. With that also, they ended that particular observatory status of the State of Israel in African Union Forum. So a new regional organization came into the fore after that. The African countries established AU, which is African Union. So the African Union now was new, and it had its own set of rules and what have not. And the State of Israel went back trying to seek, another observatory status for itself. But the African countries or the African Union denied them. So since that time, since the beginning of this century, that means 2001, it has been trying and trying and trying. So for 20 years, they denied the Israel that particular status until 2021. Okay, in 2021, they yielded to that. So they allowed the state of Israel to become an observer in African Union. They cited many reasons for that. Whether there were other reasons, that is something pretty much for the debate. But they granted Israel that particular status. So, but one thing remarkable happened. That means less than 2 years, or just a little over 2 years after Israel was granted that, African Union on their own, they came to the agreement, or they came to the conclusion that no, they needed to expel Israel. So last year in February, they did that. Something remarkable happened. If you go to the next slide, you can see a photo. Yes, the photo of Israeli diplomat being escorted out of the AU meeting. So one thing that is very interesting and remarkable was that the AU did not decided to send them a letter or inform them beforehand. No, they decided they made the decision that time during the meeting, and there and then they executed the decision. So they asked the Israeli diplomat to leave, and they were suspended indefinitely. That was last year in February, before even this current genocide started. So this, of course, will give us a little perspective about how Africa or African countries collectively, for this matter, how they collectively have been looking at the state of Israel. Despite, of course, we know African countries, majority of them are weak because of their economic status and power. So we know about that, but despite that, and despite the Western pressure or the Western countries' pressure, still they remain resolute about their relationship with Israel, because they see, or they, in their own collective psyche, they could always remember their treatment, or the treatment they receive at the hand of the Western imperialist countries. Can you go please to the next slide? I don't know how much time, how much minute do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, thank you. So collectively, I would say, okay, how African countries or African nations view Israel is something, of course, that we can say is diverse, because we do have 54 countries throughout the continent or over the continent. So it's of course, it's not natural and it's not normal for all these countries to be on the same board. But despite that, we find the great majority, an overwhelming majority of these countries, they always tend to be on the same page when it comes to this particular issue. So some countries, of course, they still maintain formal diplomatic relations with Israel, but majority of them, as I said, and as I showed in the previous, in one of the previous slides, I've shown that majority of the countries, they maintain relationship with both of them. So of course, we know that the current world order is a world order that has been placed or put in place by the countries that is in favor of course, the state of Israel. So we can understand why African countries, for the sake of recognition and for the sake of belonging, they will, of course, recognize the state of Israel, even if there is no other reasons to that. So this is something that also we have to bear in our mind. Israel, when it is part, has been trying very hard to establish, and sometimes to blackmail, sometimes to try to use some bait, for example, or trying to give or to promise some African countries some form of economic benefit and other form of benefit in order for them to get what they want from these African countries. But despite that, of course, there hasn't been, yes, some few of them had yielded to that kind of pressure, but majority of them not. Okay, can you go please to the next slide? So now we come to the current state that we are, last year, of course, after this particular genocide started, so in December there was a vote in the UN, in the UN General Assembly, and we can see this, of course, give us the entire country, or every country's voting data about the issue, and you can see that an overwhelming majority, 153 of the world countries voted for that. But that is not, of course, our concern here. What we would like to know, how many African countries voted in favor of the resolution, and how many of them did not? So one thing that I would like to say is that of all the countries, African countries that have voted, only one country voted no or against. Only one African country. And when I give you the identity of this African country, also you wouldn't be surprised. You will know why. And of course, I will just add a little information on that. The only country that voted no is Liberia. And if we all know the history of Liberia. Liberia is literally an American colony in Africa, and they still remain so because it is still a country that is largely run by American say and by American fund and what have not. So this, of course, tells you why it is only Liberia out of 54 countries that have voted, which has voted no. Of course, there were other African countries that abstained from this voting, but they were not many. They were not up to, if I'm not mistaken, they were like around maybe 5 to 7, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember exactly, but they were around, or they are around that number. So this also tells us, of course, where African countries are headed, or what is their direction in relation to this particular sensitive issue, and an issue, of course, that has been now at the center of the global debate and the center of the global politics. So can you go please to the next? No, I still see the same slide.
I'm in the last slide.
No. Okay. Yes. Okay. So now coming to the last slide for me today, which is, of course, Africa leading the way. So now we can understand why now Africa is it is from African continent that we get the country that sue or that take Israel to the ICJ. And if now you go back into the history of South Africa itself, it was a country that has suffered at the hand of similar actors. So what South Africa see is exactly its own experience, that experience that it has gone through over the years until, of course, the apartheid ended some decades ago. So now we can understand why South Africa, not only South Africa, we also have other countries on southern part of Africa where, of course, and now if I give you the context, then you can understand why it is these countries from the southern part of Africa that, of course, had been at the forefront, and they had been very vocal on this issue. For example, Zimbabwe, religious figures in Zimbabwe last month, was it last month or this month, they all unanimously agreed or called on Israel to end the genocide. This is actually in Zimbabwe, so Zimbabwe is another country that is on southern part of Africa. And if you go back in history, during the time of Mugabe, he has always been against the state of Israel because, as I said, it is actually something that is reminiscent to the experience of these African countries. And southern part of Africa is the part of Africa where, of course, the Western imperialist powers didn't want to leave. So when they colonized that part of Africa, they tried as much as they could not actually to leave that particular part of the world. Why? According to some theories, they said it is because of the climate. The Western imperialists usually follow the climate. And if you look at the global pattern of colonialism, you will find that is almost true. You find, for example, the Western imperialist powers or the Western colonizers, usually leave the countries that the climate is not suitable for them. But anywhere you find them staying, for example, you go to the places like Australia, like southern part of Africa and other parts of the world, of course, the Americas and what have not. These are places where the climate suits them and they wanted to stay. They don't want anything to do with, for example, tropical condition, because they call it the graveyard of the white man. That's what they call it themselves. So all these, of course, factors, when you look at them, then you can understand why the southern part of Africa, or these people from southern part of Africa, have been at the forefront when it comes to going against or trying to take South Africa to the, Israel to the ICJ and trying to end the genocide that is going on there. So with this, actually, or with one more sentence, I will bring and I will come to the end of my presentation today. What I would like to add is that if you want to understand African perspective or African take on this particular issue, then you can just try to look at what they do in a multilateral forum like the UN, for example. How do they vote when it comes to these issues? But of course, this is very different from the perspective of individual or of the masses of this country. So we shouldn't also mistake the state perspective with the masses perspective. So the masses perspective will be very much different, and that is not, of course, our topic today. When it is our topic, then we will probably go into that and discuss that. So with this, of course, I come to the end of my presentation, and I all thank you for being patient listening to this brief, but I think important topic of today. And I will be welcoming any form of comment, question that you might have later on at the end of the session. Thank you all.